This is actually kind of a treat for fans of the X-Men movie universe, because it's really one of the only chances you get to see any sort of concept art for these movies. Now, this version that I'm reviewing here is the collector's edition, and the difference between that and the standard edition is that this book includes the full script for X2. And now, usually I really hate when they include scripts in art or making of books, and especially if they try. So this review is for the art of X2. And what's really interesting about this book is that even though all the Marvel movies always get an art book, the X-Men films rarely do. In fact, X2 and X-Men The Last Stand are actually the only X-Men movies that have an art book. It's always seemed kind of weird to me how the more recent X-Men films never seem to have any sort of art or making of books, so this is actually kind of a treat for fans of the X-Men movie universe, because it's really one of the only chances you get to see any sort of concept art for these movies. Now, this version that I'm reviewing here is the collector's edition, and the difference between that and the standard edition is that this book includes the full script for X2. And now, usually I really hate when they include scripts in art or making of books, and especially if they try to, just include that in and, slap a collector's edition title on the front. That certainly wouldn't be worth it. But at least they also had the decency to include there's a gatefold towards the end that has sort of Nightcrawler artwork, and then also there's a section at the back. It's very small, about 8 pages, on some of the art from the first X-Men movie. So all of that taken into consideration, it is actually, quite a nice upgrade as a collector's edition. But in terms of whether the book as a whole is good, well, it's not the most impressive. The main thing it suffers from is just far too many screenshots from the film. The storyboards here are really great, especially for this really dynamic opening sequence with Nightcrawler. But yeah, so hopefully this, flip through will be really helpful in understanding whether this is worth your time and money, because I'm a huge fan of this film, but I don't necessarily think that this is a book I would need to purchase again. It really comes down to whether or not, you like what you see. I didn't think any of the art was particularly amazing. Although the one thing that I really do like about this book is they've included lots of captions and comments, which is nice because plenty of art books do not do that. And so as we go through, you will see there is quite a bit of text, but what the text that is there is really just primarily for labeling and describing the images. It's not really, there's very little in terms of insightful comments into the design or making of the movie. And when the text does include interviews of any sort, it really is just those sort of obvious and unnecessary comments that really are just sort of used to fill out the book. So, to have those, even if it is just, all it's doing is just labeling something, that's better than nothing. The number of screenshots and sort of what I would call kind of unimpressive artwork is actually a bit disappointing. I don't know, maybe it's more that just, personally, I'm not necessarily a fan of just these sort of artworks. So I think the artwork disappointed me for the same reason as the concept art for the Dark Knight trilogy did, in that I was kind of expecting it to be a lot more dynamic, visually impressive and interesting art, since they do come from a very visual medium, that of comic books, and then to look through this and the art, just judging it in terms of actual artwork, it's just not particularly great in my opinion. This book is published by Newmarket Press, who in like the early to mid 2000s used to release tons of movie books, but they were almost always sort of just like pictures from the film. They weren't really art and making of books, so the fact that this one actually gets as much art and making of as it does is actually interesting, because the type of books that Newmarket Press were publishing about movies at this time really were just sort of like almost just like picture book versions of the movies, where they take stills, put them in a book, and then, you know, try and charge fans. So you can see in this section of Mystique, there's no concept art for her at all. That's just sort of screenshots and behind the scenes pictures. The imagery is just not dynamic enough or interesting enough. There are tons of kind of actually not even very good costume and character sketches. There is just nothing in terms of developments of looks and things, or how things progressed. It is kind of disappointing. If you are interested in the making of this movie, the DVDs and Blu-rays for both the first two X-Men films have really, really fantastic behind-the-scenes features. And that's the other thing I will say for this book, is that the one thing I often complain about is layout and design of the books, and this one actually is really nice. You will have noticed there's really not a lot of wasted space at all. In fact, there's hardly any white space. Everything is sort of like they cram a lot of images and text per page, except obviously when they're doing stuff like this, but otherwise it's really good. You feel like you're getting your money's worth for each page, which is really nice. But on the whole, I am sort of on the fence about whether I personally like this book, whether I think it's, you know, as a fan, I enjoy it. What the hell is SPX? Please don't tell me that's meant to say SFX. If anyone knows if SPX stands for something that I'm not aware of, definitely let me know. Perhaps it was just a term used for the X-Men movies. I don't know. Then you get the credits, and then this next section on Nightcrawler is exclusive to this collector's edition. The good/weird thing about this collector's edition is that it seems to have been much more widely released than the you know, I guess a standard edition. That one seemed to have not get much of a release, so they're probably using the old trick of slapping collector's edition on something to get that money from you. And then this last section is also exclusive. It's the art of X-Men 1, and because there was no art book, this sort of stuff is really nice. But the problem is that I did and didn't kind of feel cheated by this section, because on the back cover they advertised this as being, you know, an 8-page bonus section on the art of X-Men 1. But then you kind of feel cheated when, you know, you get things like this that are just sort of screenshots. And what's interesting is, see, this here is probably my favorite piece of art in the book, because it really is the one that gives me the most sort of is the one to me that most resembles of like a comic book panel in a way. It's sort of very colourful and dynamic, and I know that doesn't, really work with what the vision of the film was meant to be, but it kind of does make me think that they should have put more of the artwork from X-Men 1 in here, because the stuff that I've just flipped through now is actually much better than X-Men 2 or The Last Stand. And see, this section, like, that's the only piece of concept art on this whole page. The rest is just screenshots, so it kind of feels a bit cheap on their behalf. Although what is really nice about the book is that it has really nice production qualities. It really does sort of feel like a collector's edition book. It has this really nice black faux leather cover. And also, if you find these reviews and flip-throughs helpful, please let me know by either subscribing or giving it a thumbs up, because that definitely helps out and lets me know that people are actually enjoying this. I was so excited when I found out that they were releasing this book, The World of the Witcher video game compendium, which is sort of a lore book, a guide to the world of the Witcher. And I was excited because it's so rare for, almost every video game gets an art book, but it's very rare to get a lore book. So, and then I was doubly excited because I love the world of The Witcher. The game world, not so much the book, The World of the Witcher, but I'll get into that. I just love The Witcher's it's probably my favorite medieval fantasy world, because it has things that you associate with high fantasy. It's got elves and dwarves and the monsters and magic and things like that, but it uses them in a way that is sort of unlike a lot of other high fantasy, sort of Tolkien-esque fantasies. It's really sort of grounded in this really fantastic, almost real feeling medieval world. It's almost got this dark fantasy feel to it. All the characters and the environments are quite melancholy, and they sort of have that, medieval European feel. And then it also blends all of that with European fairy tales. It's a very, the game and the books that it was based off sort of make tons of very obvious references to European fairy tales, and in a really great and unique, intelligent way. It's really a sort of a medieval fantasy cross with a sort of a dark fairy tale world, and it's really just fantastic. So that is why I was super disappointed once I started reading this book, because I'll go ahead and say it, this is not the book this game deserves, or the fans of the game deserve. This is not even a good book in and of itself. And I was looking, and it has, something like 100 5-star reviews on Amazon, which I can't really fathom. I know that a lot of it probably comes down to differences in opinion, but just, when I review these books, I try to do it as objectively as possible. And looking at this book objectively, even, trying to distance myself as being such a big fan of the Witcher series, it's not a well done book, and I can't really fathom why so many people don't really have the analytical skills to realize that what they're reading is, if not outright crap, is not what they deserve, what it should be. So it's published by Dark Horse, who have a lot of great properties that they publish books for, but they end up doing very mediocre to plain awful books for. I've said in other videos how unimpressed I was by the Legend of Korra art books, which was by Dark Horse. On my other channel, the Art and Making of, I reviewed the 300 art book, which I said was probably the worst art book of all time. So Dark Horse has a bit of a bad reputation as far as I'm concerned, and this book really solidifies it. So what is wrong with it? Well, there are tons of things. There are big glaring things, and then there's like just tons of minute, sort of almost superficial things that just kind of bugged me, like this. And I've seen it on other copies of the books from customers in the UK and America. So even on the front cover, the flames that are appearing here above Geralt's armor, can you see those green dots? It's like they haven't, rendered the flame particles properly, so there are just these weird, my camera's not very good, so it's sort of hard to see, but there are just these green dots right on, and I can't understand how someone couldn't have seen that and been like, oh, we need to change that. I didn't see anyone else complaining about that in any of the reviews, so perhaps it's just me. But yeah, so, and I guess that really typifies what I don't like about this book as a whole, is I would not be surprised at all if I found out this book was rushed in order to have it come out to coincide with the third game, which it did. So if this book was rushed to meet that deadline, then that would explain a lot. And then, so probably the most blindingly ridiculous omission in this entire book is, so this book is called The World of The Witcher, and the very first section is on the world and its history, and then it goes into the geography section, and yet there is not a single map anywhere in this book. I can't believe, how could, like, not even, the end papers they could have used as a map. And I've seen in the Witcher 3 art book a fantastic map of the continent, and that there is nothing included in a book called The World of the Witcher. No map or anything is just, again, ridiculous, and possibly speaks to the lack of attention that was paid when making this book. So I really just loved the tone of the games, as I've said, and when I was playing the games, I was sort of more focused on the story, Geralt's story, than the actual world, which definitely interested me, whenever I was sort of paying attention to those sort of details about the larger world, always piqued my interest, and so I was so looking forward to this book and learning more about it. So I certainly don't, even though I am familiar with the Witcher games, I certainly didn't consider myself a sort of a lore expert at all. In fact, I knew very little about the actual world of The Witcher, except that I really liked it, at least the tone of it. And yet, this book is so superficial. Everything, all the information it gives is so light, and even if you have never played any of the games, there's probably not enough here to really engage you. And if you are a fan of the games, there's sort of so much stuff that you're like, alright, that's obvious. When are you going to get into some of the actual good details? So the book is written sort of by Dandelion, who you will know if you've played the games. So basically what that means is it's written as if it's from the perspective of one of the characters in the game, which is, and then also each chapter is written by a different character. So having that sort of treating this as a real tome that would be in the world, written by the characters from the perspective of the characters, is interesting. I've seen a couple of other books, law books, do that, and whether it's sort of written from the perspective of the characters or sort of from a God's eye view. I don't really mind either way. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. But yeah, in this book, it just the writing is really, really awful. I believe that, I guess this would have been translated, but I still don't even think that's necessarily the problem. I think it's just the content is. See, look at this. So this is talking about the different races and the different groups in the world, and so non-humans and their lands. So dwarves, and that's all you get on dwarves. Look at that. That's like 2 paragraphs. Ridiculous. I mean, there is a little bit more information spread throughout, but that's to have that be like the section on dwarves. It's just, the whole thing is rushed. I mean, I hope it's rushed, because if this is someone's, if this is Dark Horse and CD Projekt Red's attempt at creating a really great book, then that is just... So I studied history in school and still very much consider myself an armchair historian. So I'm very used to the sort of, dry, scholarly books that sort of drone on and on about different dates and regions and things, and I always find them entertaining. But this book nearly put me to sleep. In fact, I might as well just go ahead and admit it. I didn't even finish this book, which has never ever happened for me with a book like this. I would always finish it, and especially for one who, when I really enjoy this world. So for me to not finish it certainly speaks to how much I didn't like it and how boring it was. The text is just so boring. I was saying how light and it is, and I really can't even just put my finger on how boring it is and how uninteresting it was reading it all. There's no sense of, and for a you might expect that sort of thing from a real history book, but for that to happen in a fantasy game like this is honestly, it's unacceptable. There's no sense of sort of storytelling either at all, and which is really weird when the book is written by characters from the game. Additionally, people have sort of raved about the imagery in this book, and I'm not impressed with it either, because if one or the other were actually really good and gave me the sort of the feeling that I had when I was playing the game, but they just don't. So I've talked about the text, but the actual images are very hit and miss. They certainly do not fit in with the idea that this is an in-world book that's been written by Dandelion. I mean, like, sort of art like that, and then there are sort of 3D imagery from the game, so that sort of takes the authenticity out. But I could certainly overlook that if the selection that they had chosen was really good, which is not. And I thought that perhaps I was being a bit too harsh, and maybe that my impression that I had got from playing the games was maybe I'd forgotten a bit, or I was a bit hadn't been given the right impression. But then when I looked through the art book for The Witcher 3, which came with the collector's edition, There were much, much better artworks in that they could have chosen, works that definitely evoked the sort of feeling that I got from playing the game and better represented the world than what was chosen for this book. So, I mean, that at least makes me think that, you know, my opinion was correct. And then also, there was there was this very big, thick collector's edition game guide for The Witcher 3, and that had in it a lot of sort of like background information on the characters, artworks. There was tons of imagery. There was even a whole art section, and yeah, again, very like this book, information on the characters and the world and stuff, and that was fantastic. I wish that this book had have been more like the game guide, the content that was included in the game guide. But I didn't get that because it's just sort of a very thin section of the game guide, because obviously most of that guide is dedicated to, you know, telling you what to do in the game and stuff. But so I just don't know how this. I mean, there are a few good images, but from ones I've seen in the art books and online and in the game and in the game guide, this just does not represent what this book should have been, nor what the game is. So the best part about the book are these. They have these sort of like little sections all throughout, and these are like excerpts from other, you know, books that are in the world. So this is from Tales of Weapons by some guy who's a master swordsmith, and these little extracts from other works are actually, they were really good, and I'm not sure why they were so much better than the text that's in here. One theory that I sort of thought was maybe that these are taken from, so if you've played the game, you know that there are lore books that you can read in the game, and I wonder if these sections are taken from that, which would certainly explain why they're better than the text, because the body text, because if these are written by the same person or people, then that's really weird. I don't know what went on there, but they always feel, those little sections always feel a lot more story-like, and they always excite me in a way that remind me of the game and make me want to find out more, and I want these to be expanded, and, you know, I feel like give me more of, you know, whatever they're talking about in a lot of these boxes. Not all of them, but certainly a lot. And then I get stuck with just sort of like this section on what is magic. It's kind of just boring drivel. It doesn't even really help me understand the world or the characters or the story. I think maybe that should have been perhaps the focus of this book. Is so the last section is about the story of Geralt, and it goes by very quickly, and it does have spoilers for the third game, in case anyone was wondering, but maybe they should have just expanded that section and had this sort of, you know, maybe the book should have been Dandelion's retelling of Geralt's adventures through the game, and then having, you know, sections like this expand upon the world and the history of the world. And I mean, there's just so many ways you could have made this book much better, and that's just, you know, one off the top of my head, and I think that would have worked much better. There's just so much that I remembered from the game that I was excited about possibly reading in this book, and then it just never appears. So many great characters are just missing as well. and like everything about like the sort of Arthurian mythology that often appears in the book as well. The things about the Lady of the Lake and things like that is just, I don't recall there being any mention to any of that sort of stuff in here either. In fact, there are hardly any pictures at all of any dwarves or elves. The Scoia'tael, don't really make any appearances in the book. It's just bizarre, and I don't know, it's just ultimately very, very disappointing. A lot of people disagree with me and seem to really enjoy it, which is fantastic, but I just wonder if maybe they are expectations are very low, or they're not perhaps very analytical, and they're just sort of fanboys who will buy anything that has the name of a franchise they like printed on it. But this is certainly not the book that the fans of this game deserve, nor is it the book that this game, this world of The Witcher. This is a review of The Art of the Adventures of Tintin. Admittedly, there was not a single aspect of the movie I enjoyed, but I am a big fan of Weta and their books, and so decided to give this one a shot anyway, and boy am I glad I did, because this is a fantastic book. The author is Chris Guise, or maybe it's Geis or Gies, but I'm gonna guess Guise. Anyway, Chris has worked at Weta since the Lord of the Rings days and is actually the lead concept designer on The Adventures of Tintin. So he's obviously in the best position of anyone to create a book like this. Many a time we've seen that working on the movie doesn't necessarily mean you're capable of writing a great book on it, but thankfully this book's an example of that working out well, which was something I was confident in when straight out of the gate he won me over as a reader with his opening author's note that echoes sentiments I've expressed in countless reviews. So I'll read the start of it here. The way I've written this book is unlike most art of books out there. In the following pages, you'll see many images for things that never made it into the final film. So many times I've read books where they show approved designs which closely resemble the final design, then they show a screenshot from the film. All the design work leading up to that final image is never seen by the public, and, as a fan and an artist, that irritates the heck out of me. In this book, you'll see a wide variety of imagery from all steps of the process, blah blah blah, and understand how every design decision led to that final shot on the big screen. So that is just brilliant. Too bad it's essentially bullshit, or at least a grossly misleading exaggeration. Does the book have elements of that stuff? Yeah, absolutely. Is it a feature noteworthy of such a bold opening declaration? Not in the slightest. In this book, the amount of stuff that closely resembles what you see on screen is no different to most other art books, and to suggest otherwise is unseemly, disappointing, hypocritical, and should absolutely be condemned. Which really sucks, because despite not living up to that promise, the book is actually really great. So why is the author shooting it in the foot, setting up ideals it doesn't live up to? Plus, throwing down that gauntlet isn't particularly wise in this case given the nature of the movie, considering that 1. The characters and scenes were already designed by O'Shea 80 years ago, and 2. The vision for this movie was to be as faithful to his work as possible. So there's not a whole lot of freedom in how things are going to look, snowy is snowy. There's not a page of exploration where they played around with him being a husky or a goldfish or something. So it's unavoidable that most of the stuff closely resembles the final product. And in terms of the heavy emphasis on things that never made it into the film, again, there are a few, and they are awesome. Some unseen locations and specific gags, but not a lot. Certainly no more or better than most other art books, which is a pathetically low bar anyway. So this opening paragraph is absolute nonsense and the only thing I detest about the book, and this could have been completely avoided and thus made a more positive impression just by omitting that one single paragraph, which at its core is false. Probably not appropriate for this project anyway, and just begging for scrutiny. For example, look at this page while I reread part of it. So many times I've read books where they show approved designs which closely resemble the final design, then they show a screenshot from the film. Honestly, the only part of the book that truly lives up to the opening and shows what the book should have been based on that promise is the section on Omar's palace, which shows about a dozen varying designs and some unused ideas. But despite the fact that that makes it, unsurprisingly, the best part, it also severely highlights how the rest of the book doesn't do that by comparison. An important thing to know about this book that does make it a little more unique compared to other art books is that there's quite a lot of what we would traditionally think of as making of, which is also explained in the preface, so I'll read that too. I also wanted to explore the world of digital creativity. I feel that too often in the past, this has been seen as just technicians following orders from the real artists. With this book, I wanted to dispel that myth. Whether they build digital models, performance capture movement, or create artificial hair on a dog, everyone working on the design phase of a movie is an artist in some form. The same for the actors and on-set crew. Now, while I completely agree with that sentiment too, I think that for most people the expectation is that the art of refers to just the conceptual and design artworks, and anything else about the production that falls outside of that is making of. So although this book has the title The Art of, it does bring certain making of ideas into the fold. You'll see a bunch of motion capture behind the scenes photos and images more to do with technical animation and design, and I think that's fine. Playing with and expanding those definitions to not be so rigid can make an individual book much stronger, of which this is proof, but only because it's been very intelligently and appropriately implemented, which contributes enormously to its success. And that's because the movie itself is kind of a unique hybrid of animation and live action in terms of its production, and it's so great to see the book reflect that. But I do just want to highlight this inclusion of digital artistry and animation just so you know what to expect, that it's not just concept art. And so naturally there's a good amount of text, which in art books I can take it or leave it, just as long as it's not bad text taking up space. But in this book it's very important and absolutely terrific, miles ahead of the uninteresting drivel you typically get in art books. To the point that the text and the previously mentioned making of stuff is what takes this from a 3-star book to a 4-star one. The text is mostly very interesting commentary from the people who worked on what you're looking at, and the content of that commentary clearly supports the imagery and direction of the book. It's specific and focuses on the hows and whys, i.e. the most important elements for text in any art or making of book. And I particularly liked the focus on the attention to detail and the openness and explanation of the different challenges they faced. Sometimes the how and why are left hanging, but overall, especially in conjunction with the images, a lot of really great, really eye-opening stuff that gives an appreciation of certain design and animation challenges I wouldn't have considered otherwise. But, you know, it's still an art book, so the text makes up the minority and only covers so much. But I'm always so thrilled whenever I finally get to review books that are actually well authored and worth reading, because those are just inexplicably rare qualities for art and making of books. The book's divided into 2 major sections. The first focuses on character design and makes up about 40% of the book, and that's where you find a lot of the text and animation making of stuff I was referring to. There's less of that once you get into the second section, which is the environments and more scenic production paintings, which makes up about 60% of the book. And this is really where it starts to become more of a straight-up art book, and the art itself is wonderful. The amount of detail, the content of what's being depicted, it's very illustrative and cinematic. I like both of the book's sections equally for their differences, and probably the major thing that stands out as being particularly impressive is how the book achieves a remarkable balance of all its requisite elements, which is the absolute hardest thing to do in making any book. There are a lot of often conflicting plates that need to be spun, and Chris has handled them much more deftly than most other authors are capable of. And of course, this is only made possible thanks to some pretty good layout, which has allowed the book to be absolutely packed with content. Although this is prevented from being even better by a lot of poor image sizing decisions, but at least there's not an inch of blank space to be found. It's also cool how they've been able to include the original comic panels for reference and comparison, but keeping them small and unintrusive. In fact, there's a huge emphasis on artworks that recreate the original panels in a style more appropriate for their movie, but although I got a kick out of it and found them interesting, it's definitely far too overused. As for the graphic design elements, I am glad the book uses them and has a look. However, I think the way it's been realized is a little too garish and amateurish, as surprising as that may sound, but that's pretty innocuous. My only other criticism is a continuation of my dissatisfaction with the opening paragraph of the author's note. In this case, it's the use of giant final character renders and stills from the movie that do not need to be here. Now, there's only like 20 stills in the book, which is nothing, and there's not too many final character models, although the close-up detail is remarkable to examine. But the reason these elements are a problem is because not only do they kind of fly in the face of the ideology outlined in the preface, but it's also made particularly aggravating when there's also another note at the end in which Chris laments the thousands of images that couldn't fit into the book, and yet space is being taken up flaunting worthless full-page screenshots. And just like my issue with the opening statement, I wouldn't have even commented on this except for the fact that the author's drawing unnecessary attention to it. So I guess the whole point I'm trying to make with this review is tear out the front and back author's notes and you've got a pretty terrific book. This is a review of Tales from the Sea of Thieves, and I'm so glad they tried to do something like this for Sea of Thieves because I'm just obsessed with these immersive in-world type books. Unfortunately, while the concept, images, and presentation are superb, the text is a massive letdown. But let's start with the good stuff. So, like I said, visually and physically, this book is magnificent in its presentation and design. The feel of the cover, the rough matte paper with its aged and stained look that doesn't just repeat the same pattern every page. It's published by Titan, who also did similarly designed books for the Elder Scrolls, and one thing I criticized was how they kind of spoiled the design by printing a barcode on the back. Well, it looks like they've acknowledged that mistake because this one's completely unmarred, so well done, Titan. Then there's the wonderful imagery, which as far as I can tell are all concept artworks that have already been included in the Sea of Thieves art book, which I've reviewed previously. So if you have that book, don't be expecting to see anything new here, but I really didn't mind that. I feel like the way the pieces have been repurposed and presented here is really fresh and looks a lot better in this context. But while the book looks incredible, the text is another matter, which is very unfortunate as that's the main event. Now, the first thing I want to establish straight up, I have seen so many people referring to this as a lore book, which is completely misleading. It is not a lore book by any stretch of the imagination. The amount of actual lore in here could fit on the back of a postcard. What this book actually is basically an in-world journal. The first half is written by a wealthy, scholarly young man on his journey to become a pirate captain and learn about the pirate world. But frankly, it's just very boring. And I'm not saying it's awful, just very uninspiring and lackluster, which is kind of inexcusable considering the rousing subject matter. It just feels like a light, humdrum description and dramatization of what you do in the game, which unfortunately is not much. Now, in a way, that's kind of the point of these sort of books, to capture something of this digital world and bring it into our own. And so I have to wonder if the game itself might be a little bit to blame. Now, I haven't played Sea of Thieves since shortly after launch, so if I say anything that doesn't reflect the current state of the game, you'll know why. But this is still fair since this book came out at that same time. And so if you don't know, at launch, Sea of Thieves was heavily criticized for a serious lack of things to do, and once you broke through the gorgeous, promising outer shell, you find it's really just made up of a hollow core. And that's the exact same problem this book has. However, to blame the game for the book's faults is a flimsy excuse, and I feel that the majority of the blame is due to dull, uninspired writing. A better author would have been able to overcome any limitations of the game world, to add to it, to give deeper background, or just make it feel more exciting and fire you're in a swashbuckler and make you want to jump into the game. The art and design of this book do that, but the writing doesn't. So then halfway into the book, it switches narrators, and actually gets noticeably better. It's funnier, and there's a little more of an interesting story to it, still quite slow and tedious, but a lot more engaging. until it completely shits the bed with the most anticlimactic non-ending imaginable. And I was left so disappointed to realize that any mystery, any larger story that was being built up was just tossed overboard, and I'd been strung along on a completely pointless tease of a journey. And so not only is the quote-unquote story not interesting or entertaining, but the book also doesn't do a good job of informing you about this world or representing it. Really, the only thing I think that was well done with the text was how it frequently worked in things you actually do in the game, but even then, that's just a novelty that doesn't offer any deeper insight or background to the world. Like at one point, the narrator wonders why the merfolk save and transport stranded pirates, and is that part of some ancient pact? Now that's an interesting question, but wouldn't it be more interesting if the book actually gave you an answer or background to that? In fact, based on the title, I thought this was going to be a book about sort of pirate myths and legends from the Sea of Thieves world. But any of that stuff hinted at in the game is barely explored here. Or as another example, the first narrator is actually a kind of notable NPC in the game, but there's absolutely no payoff. There are plenty of fun references for fans, but they just feel like pointless Easter eggs, like, hey, it's that thing from the game, so what? And look, I know, at least at the time, Sea of Thieves is more understated and mysterious with its lore, and that's one of the things I loved about it, how you'd come across little clues and references that you'd have to interpret and put together yourself to form a larger image of this world. But even in that sense, this isn't something the book is playing to in any sort of satisfying or creative way. And so overall, if I had my time again, I honestly wouldn't buy this book, and that represents an inexcusable and embarrassing failure on the part of the author, publisher, and developer, because in terms of the concept of this book, I feel like I'm the perfect audience. I'm obsessed with these sort of in-world books. I love the world of Sea of Thieves, and even just the pirate theme in general. And yet, except for the fact that the idea is really fun and the book looks incredible, I'm just left very underwhelmed and disappointed. And so, in deciding whether or not you may like the book, just ask yourself, why do you want it, and in what ways do you expect it to satisfy you? And then see how that compares to the comments I've made, and I think you'll have your answer. Because the text, you can basically cross that out. The images are brilliant, but already in the art book along with so much more. And so all that's left is the fact that it looks really cool, and there is certainly some degree of fun to be had just flipping through and looking at it, but is that worth the price? And you know, sometimes the novelty and whimsy of these sort of books alone is all they need in order to be appealing, but this book's just not doing enough for that to be the case. So honestly, the only person I could imagine who would want to own this book is if you are a big fan of the game and think you will be able to appreciate it just as a tangible memento of the game, in which case it'll probably be nice to have just as a piece of cool merch. If you're not familiar with the game, but you're intrigued by the book just because you're a fan of the pirate genre and you like the look of it, it's certainly possible for you to read this book without any prior knowledge, but I just don't know if it's worth it. There are a few concepts and references that will confuse you, and even as someone who's played the game, I found the writing to be pretty unclear and confusing at times anyway, with things very poorly explained. But on that note, if you are the sort of person who, like myself, enjoys these sort of immersive, interactive books, and you're a big fan of the pirate genre, there is a surprising number you may be interested in checking out. How good they actually are is up for debate, but I thought you might want to be aware of them nonetheless. First up, there are a couple of non-fiction books done in this style, such as Pirates by John Matthews and its sequel, Pirates Most Wanted, which I think is the same book as Pirates Rogues Gallery, published under a different title maybe. There's also another book called Pirate Soul. Then getting into a blend of fiction and non-fiction is the extraordinary Pirateology and the Pirateology Handbook, which is part of the Ologies series, and while they are aimed at children, I just think they are unrivaled when it comes to these sort of books. There are also a number of kind of interesting but not really amazing Pirates of the Caribbean tie-ins, the best of which is probably The Secret Files or The Pirate Guidelines. And then lastly, we have Assassin's Creed Black Flag, Blackbeard, The Lost Journal, which is very similar to Tales from the Sea of Thieves in terms of theme and concept. And while it also leaves much to be desired, I actually like it a lot better than the Sea of Thieves one, which on the surface should not be the case. Sea of Thieves has every advantage in terms of what I find appealing. It's fun, colourful, richer, has the huge advantage of being fantasy, and it came out 5 years after the Assassin's Creed book, so had the benefit of learning from its mistakes. And so it should have blown the much more dour and constrained Assassin's Creed book out of the water, but the fact that it doesn't really reflects very poorly on Tales from the Sea of Thieves. However, if you are interested in a deeper dive into the Assassin's Creed Blackbeard journal, keep an eye to the horizon, as I will be doing a review on it very soon. This is a review of The Art of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. If you haven't seen it already, I think it might be helpful to first watch the review I did on The Art of Assassin's Creed Origins, just as a point of reference for some of the things I'm going to discuss here. I will be reiterating a lot of the same stuff just because they are so similar, but I also want to highlight any differences. The biggest difference being that while I only kind of liked the Origins book, I really, really like this one. Well, the art at least, which is the first time I can say that about an Assassin's Creed art book, although as an art book it still does wallow in many of the same lamentable shortcomings that have always plagued these Assassin's Creed art books, but those can be chalked up to minor annoyances when compared to just how incredible the art is, which is of course the deciding factor for acquiring any art book. Although, as I talked about in the Origins review, because it's the art, that means it's completely subjective and you may have a completely different opinion. But in terms of my impression, I just can't stress how breathtaking and inspiring the artwork is. My previous issues regarding Assassin's Creed concept art are still very much present in this book, but they are significantly diminished thanks to a wider balance of types of art and the actual content being depicted in the works and the look everything has. It's really overcome those issues. For example, it's still very much done in that same blurry, unpolished around the edges style I talked about in the last video, but it just doesn't feel like as much of an issue. Likewise, my dissatisfaction with what was being depicted and how it was being depicted and the somber nature of the art has also seen a major change that's really responsible for this adoration. I mean, to be fair, it's a change that really started with the Unity art book and then Syndicate, where a lot of the art became less focused on vistas and individual characters and more on vignettes evoking story, action that inflamed the imagination. Obviously, Syndicate and Unity were at a significant disadvantage given their bleak settings didn't really lend themselves to rising above the dour feeling that dominated Assassin's Creed concept art, whereas the more exotic and fantastical setting of semi-mythical ancient Greece has been embraced, and for the first time the art has more vibrance to the colours and lighting that really brings it alive in a way I haven't seen for Assassin's Creed concept art before, especially when combined with this more interesting direction of what they're choosing to depict, or at least show in this book, for the first time captures the excitement and beauty of the games. It still looks like Assassin's Creed art, but it also looks so different to anything previous. I've always found the art books underwhelming and a little boring, even Origins, but this one, the art is such a pleasure to look at again and again. I've lost track of how many times I've gone through it. In terms of book design, like all Assassin's Creed art books, at first glance it looks stunning, until you start to pay attention to the pretty awful sizing and layout of the images that almost comes close to ruining the book, because function is being sacrificed for form in an attempt to sell a book that looks impressive. Now, I love me a handsome art book, but never at the expense of content, which is the actual reason I buy these books and should always be priority number one. So when you have a book like this, where 90% of the images are at least twice as large as they need to be, that means the book's missing out on potentially double the amount of content it could have, which is especially annoying because I've seen tons of great concept art for the game online that isn't included in this book. Similarly, like in all Assassin's Creed art books, this decision to put form over function includes an overabundance of images running across 2 pages, which results in crap like this, where you have the main figure of an artwork almost completely lost in the center, spoiling the image. One interesting thing I noticed was that for a number of environment images, the captions note that they are in-game captures or 3D renders, contrary to how I feel about film stills in movie art books or stills from a game's cutscenes. I think in-game photography is a completely different situation, and I really like it as long as they look great and have merit, which these ones do. But I wanted to point this out as I know some people will be really annoyed they're taking up space with captures and renders that should be used for art. Though what's really weird is I can't actually tell most of them are in-game captures. Like even when the text points it out, the images just don't look 3D or like they're from the game at all, to the point that I wonder if maybe there's been some confusion in what the book is terming in-game captures, or maybe it's just me. At any rate, this appreciation of in-game photography and location renders does not extend to 3D character and object renders, which this book does have a few of. So for some characters like Pythagoras or Socrates, or pretty much all of the ships, there's no actual art, just a full-page 3D render looking like it's been taken straight out of the game. This book also follows the unfortunate trend of other Assassin's Creed art books, where there is very little exploration of designs, early concepts, unused ideas, etc. There is a little bit more than there was in Origins, which is nice, but most of the characters look exactly how they appear in the game. They've even taken up space including the exact same concept artwork of Layla already seen in the Origins book. And like in the Origins book, it's especially frustrating when the text next to the character says something like, "We explored so many different versions for such and such," and all we get is one full-page image of that character looking like they do in the game. Or look at Medusa, for example, who you'd think would be a character with so many design possibilities, yet all we get is 4 almost identical images taking up a whole spread, and that's it. After the absolute shit show that was the text in the Origins art book, I was so thrilled to learn that this book was going to have a different author. Unfortunately, although she is less obnoxious, she's made the lazy and inept decision to try and follow as closely in the previous author's footsteps as possible. So all we get is one hack trying to imitate the last hack. And I mean, it's not just the authors, the editors, publisher, Ubisoft, even the team members who contributed commentary should all be absolutely ashamed that this is their continued approach. The overall direction of the text is established in the foreword by the art director, which has nothing to do with the art, the development of the game, not even anything personal on what it was like creating it. It's literally just a hyping up of how amazing the game is. It's the exact sort of aggrandizing PR jargon you hear when games are announced on stage at E3 or something. Our dynamic day and night cycles, players will be blessed with the chance to explore our most compelling setting ever. And usually I don't mind forwards being indulgent, but in this case it's not only extra pathetic, but portentous of the book's text overall. The direct commentary from the artists themselves has dwindled to almost nothing. It seriously feels like there's about 20 one-sentence quotes from people who actually worked on the game, only half of which are interesting, but too short for any actual insight, and the other half are just frivolous. Essentially zero behind-the-scenes info or anything about the creation of the game or art. And the author, whose words make up 99% of the text, doesn't offer anything interesting enough to make up for that either. Like I said in the Origins book, the text on historical and mythological information is interesting, but it just feels like occasional trivia, and if they weren't going to put effort into having good behind-the-scenes text, they could have at least doubled down on the historical info and made that the sole direction of the book. Other than that, the text boils down to 2 categories. 1, marketing pitch fluff highlighting how incredible different aspects of the game are and what an amazing journey the game is for players, or 2, descriptions of who the characters are, the locations, and the story. And again, I'm just left wondering, for whose benefit is any of that? If you've already played the game, you know about the characters and story, and they don't need to keep pitching all the amazing stuff you do in the game, so it's all just a waste of your time. Reading it, you'd think it's being aimed at people who haven't played the game, which is doubly ridiculous, considering the text is also riddled with spoilers. So who do they perceive is going to find this sort of text valuable? The real answer is they're lazy and don't care. And why shouldn't they be? All they need to do to get your money is make sure that the book looks good at a glance when you flick through it or see pictures of it. In fact, if this book had had no text, I would have been slightly surprised and disappointed, but it wouldn't have really bothered me, whereas this is just insulting and why I'm making such a big deal out of something relatively unimportant. I mean, I truly wish I could tell you not to get the book to show that fans won't support this kind of crap and hopefully encourage change, but I can't, because despite its serious flaws as an art book, these are far, far outstripped by the amazing art itself, and so I don't regret getting it for a second. And so, just to wrap up, let's quickly run through the other Assassin's Creed art books, because I'm probably not ever going to do reviews on them, but like I said, my opinions of the art in the books are completely subjective, and so despite everything I've said about them, I still absolutely encourage you to look into them and form your own opinion. So the first art book I'm aware of was for Assassin's Creed 1 that came with the limited edition strategy guide, and this wasn't like some tacked on extra you see with a lot of strategy guides that claim to feature art. This was a completely separate, full, proper hardcover art book. Then there was a Japanese book that combined art from the first two games. No art books for Brotherhood or Revelations beyond, those crappy little art books that come with collector's editions of games. In fact, I believe all of the main Assassin's Creed games have one of those, but it was the art of Assassin's Creed 3 that was the first real, independent, mass-released art book in English for Assassin's Creed. This was the first one I ever got, and where my disappointment all began. Looking back, that's unfortunate, though not surprising, as it's definitely the weakest entry. It wasn't even particularly well designed and only had 140 pages, whereas all the others have around 200. The art of Black Flag was then another huge letdown, as it failed to capture that idea of exotic, swashbuckling pirate adventure the game had. Then the art books for Unity and Syndicate, which I actually think they really stepped up their game in terms of art, layout, and design, but by the time they rolled around, I'd sort of given up, and like I said earlier, the setting of those games wasn't really conducive for turning around my established opinions of Assassin's Creed concept art. Then of course we get to Origins and Odyssey, which has now actually kind of got me excited for the art of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Well, the art anyway, not the layout and text, which I doubt will see any change. One thing that sucks about art books being released concurrent with the game is they never get to feature any of the DLC art. I think it'd be really cool if they made a compilation book collecting art from the various DLCs. Also, all of the art books since Assassin's Creed 3 have had limited collector's versions, but anyone with a brain needn't worry about those. There's also a bunch of other Assassin's Creed related books that feature concept art, but I won't take up any more time going through those here, as I will be doing reviews on all of them very soon. This is a review of The Art of Assassin's Creed Origins. I am a big fan of the Assassin's Creed games, and especially of the way they look and the worlds and just how well realized they are. And if this channel is any indication, I also kind of like art books. Yet I've never been a fan of the Assassin's Creed art books, partially because I don't think they're well done at all in terms of what one should expect from a video game art book, but mostly it has to do with the fact that, for whatever reason, the art has just never really enthralled me. Of course, that's just my personal opinion, and you may well have a completely different one. I would never want any personal dissatisfaction I have with the art to turn someone off a book they might otherwise enjoy, nor undermine the enthusiasm of anyone who does like it. The single most determining factor in whether or not you should get an art book is always how much do you like what you're seeing in the flip-through. Often you don't even know why something does or doesn't appeal to you. It just does, and that's fine. However, since I am doing a review, I want to at least try and articulate my impression of Assassin's Creed art as a whole, just so you know where I'm coming from when I get into this Origins book more specifically. So I think the smallest contributing factor is because the predominant art style for Assassin's Creed concept art is that muddy digital painting style that lacks definition and detail, with a lot of sketchy skid marks over the top and around the edges that just make it feel unpolished and cheap. And so looking through the Assassin's Creed art books always makes me feel like I'm someone with poor vision who doesn't have their glasses on, and so everything looks kind of blurred. The fact that the text on the back of this book claims fully rendered paintings is either a gross over-exaggeration, or we have very different definitions of what fully rendered means. And listen, I'm not saying the artists aren't enormously talented. It is almost always epic and stunning work, just perhaps not rendered in a way I find especially appealing. But that feels like a minor issue. I think the major turnoff for me when it comes to Assassin's Creed concept art has more to do with the actual content of the art, specifically what's being depicted and how it's being depicted. The art rarely inspires the sort of excitement it should, and I don't feel it reflects what I love about the games. It tends to be pretty gloomy and moody. In fact, the actual word that comes to mind when looking at Assassin's Creed concept art is quiet, which might seem like a strange word to describe visual art, but that's the most accurate way to convey the impression most of the art makes on me. Quiet, contemplative, and somber, which actually sound like good words to describe a game about assassins, but to me it doesn't reflect the games which I think of as being so alive and exciting and richly detailed. Even though this Origins book largely follows the established art style, I feel it's a little less severe, to the point where this is the first time I liked the art more than I disliked any of the other problems the book has. But the main thing that's responsible for this appreciation is the Egyptian setting. I am completely in love with the Orientalist art from the late 18th to early 20th centuries, and visions of Egypt, Arabia, anything exotic really has always captivated me, and so I can't help but be drawn to that imagery regardless of the style or whether I feel it reflects the game. I would have also expected that to be true of the art for the first Assassin's Creed and Black Flag, but for the previously mentioned reasons, that just wasn't the case. I think a lot of that also has to do with the art for Origins being a little less dour and embracing more of the exotic. One thing that really disappointed me with the game was how the Egyptian setting was gypped in terms of having to share the game with a Greco-Roman influence. Since today we're all already so familiar with ancient Egypt being in ruins and culturally dominated, I had hoped the game would be set during a period that would have shown Egypt in all its glory. The book's design is also very nice and has great visual appeal overall. However, it retains one minor and one major problem present in all Assassin's Creed art books. The minor issue is the reliance on images running across 2 pages, and I don't mean like as a full page spread. I mean having 75% of an image on one page and 25% on the other, or sometimes literally just an inch running over the opposite page, which at best is done to promote visual cohesion and balance across a spread and allow certain images to be larger. But this is often done at the expense of the artworks themselves, which are disrupted by and lost in the center crevice of the book. However, I will say, though I'm still not crazy about the approach, this book has handled it pretty effectively as far as such things go. The major and much more serious offense, however, is that 90% of the images are way too large, which is especially unnecessary when A, this book's pages are huge, and B, because of the sketchy, smudgy, rough around the edges style used by most of the art, these images tend to lack definition and detail and so don't need to be this big. Character art for Assassin's Creed is usually a bit more detailed than the environment and key art, but even so, having a single image of a character take up an entire huge page is something I hate. Because even when that size is okay, there's usually a lot of space where they should have put other images or text on the page, which is very important because that leads to what I'm sure will be a point of huge dissatisfaction for a lot of people, and that is there is zero design exploration or evolution of the character designs. The only sort of exception being Cleopatra, who's shown with 2 other looks, and Bayek maybe has some different costume sketches, but basically he's the same as he appears in the game. But beyond that, we're not treated to any exploration of the characters' designs, no alternative or unused ideas, nothing. Which is particularly frustrating when the text makes reference to that. So for example, with Layla, the accompanying commentary says, "We went through a lot of iterations for Layla, yet the book only has one image of her looking exactly like she does in the game." Ditto the spread on Aya, the text says, "We worked on several hair, face and costume options, and yet what do we get? One full page artwork of her looking exactly like she does in the game, and on the other page just 3 turnaround renders of her head, again, exactly how she looks in the game, which is just so inexcusable when you have so many unnecessarily giant images taking up space which they could have used to include more stuff. Likewise, there's no discussion on why any of these characters were chosen for the game, or how they came about or developed in terms of who they are. Again, nothing. Now that we've got to the text, let me say it is possibly the worst I've ever read for an art book. Truly a despicable disgrace. Half of the words of the book's author, Paul Davies, the other half is commentary from the artists and such, and the overwhelming sensation you get from all of them is snake oil salesmen trying to pitch to you just how amazing this game world is. We did extensive historical research to make sure the player feels like they've gone back in time. Inane soundbite stuff that feels like you're reading a magazine article designed to impress you rather than actual behind the scenes or creative insight, which is just such an embarrassing and worthless waste of time and space when your reader has already played the game or is planning to anyway, and they're obviously not accounting for the latter anyway since the book contains spoilers. Like, what percent of people get this book with no intention of playing the game but are so awed by the text that they're then compelled to do so? It feels like someone giving you their resume after they've already been working for you for 6 months and it's like, yeah, we're past that, stop wasting my time. And the author and editors and developers know that, they're just lazy. There's also a lot of emphasis on recounting historical facts about certain locations, which in and of themselves are interesting, but not really why I'm here. I mean, even if that was the sole direction the book was going to take, being sort of a fact file to the things you're seeing, that'd be unexpected for an art book, but at least it would be something. Because as it stands, it just feels like occasional trivia with no indication of how that information is important to the art or the game's development. Any other text that falls outside those two categories is simply not interesting in the slightest. Just garbage. So much stating the obvious, describing things you're looking at, describing who the characters are, retelling the story, none of which is helped by the fact that I cannot stand the author's way of writing. It's what takes the text from being just boring to absolutely insufferable. His blathering embellishments for descriptions and information on things that are just so obvious or insipid, and I have never read such drivel in an art book before. I'll give you an example. So there's just a picture of a random helmet and the accompanying text says, "A Greek-style helmet that has seen better days, but is more intimidating now that it belongs to a bandit leader. Its battle-worn appearance reflects the I-don't-give-a-damn nature of its new owner. The fact that whoever this may be has plainly survived many battles is enough to ensure their threats will be taken seriously." So why is he explaining this like I'm a 5-year-old reading a DK book? Also, what is that description? Not only is it complete conjecture, but even more offensive is that these sort of pedestrian observations are being passed off as insight worth reading and taking up space for. And God, then there's all the adjectives, the embellishments. Everything is described as superb, sweeping, impressive, exquisitely detailed, blah blah blah. Here's another one. It's an image of Bayek sitting on a camel, and the text says, "An Egyptian vista complements our hero's linen-covered camel." So, just describing what anyone with eyes already knows, this portrait by Martin Deschambault could justifiably hang in a national gallery. Yuck. Now, I'm not disputing that it's a fantastic piece of art, but that's a patronizingly over-the-top thing for anyone to say. And in a book like this, it's also inappropriate, shameless, and stupid. This book already has too much of Ubisoft rubbing its own nipples without the addition of some sycophant jerking them off in the hopes they'll hire him for their next book. But anyway, despite this being my favorite Assassin's Creed art book up to that point, I seriously doubt I'd get it if I had my time again. It's one of those books that's great to look through once, but not worth paying for and keeping unless you're a collector or really do like the art you've seen. And if you are an Assassin's Creed fan and this review kind of has you feeling down, well, hang in there, as there is a shining light on the horizon that will be the subject of the next review. This is a review of Breakfast at Tiffany's, the official 50th anniversary companion. I consider this book to be a must-have for fans of the movie, and yet, if it were a tie-in to a more modern movie, I would absolutely hate it. It does so many things that I typically dislike in books, but I think when the subject is a movie that's achieved a 50th anniversary, it's okay for it to be a little more indulgent and entitled to a little more leniency from the reader, as long as it also brings the goods, which I think this book certainly does, though opinions will vary. And so what I want to do is position you to make sure you're looking at it from the correct angle, the way it's intended to be viewed, so that you can establish realistic expectations and enjoy the book for what it is. Because while in a broad sense, this book is about the making of the movie, that's probably not how you should think about it. In fact, I like how the title judiciously avoids using any reference to making of or behind the scenes, and so it's the 50th anniversary companion part that is the most telling. This book is supposed to be a classy retrospective, the ultimate coffee table keepsake to be treasured by fans. And yet I do not want to suggest that the book is fluff without any real substance, because that's not the case at all. It contains a heap of great information about the making of the movie, and it's easily the best behind-the-scenes source available, even compared to the 50th anniversary Blu-ray. But that still doesn't mean it's deep or comprehensive. Not only is it a fairly quick read, but some people might feel frustrated by just how little of the book directly relates to the making of the movie, and that most of the content is just filler. So you've got to view it as being more of an expansion on things related to the movie. A lot of focus on subjects that are Breakfast at Tiffany's adjacent. But again, also a lot of great stuff that is directly about the making of the movie. It walks a very fine line really well, I think, which makes me try to be very careful not to oversell or undersell the substance of the book. But I think one of the main things to consider with books like this that are on older movies is how understanding are you willing to be? How much slack are you willing to cut it due to the fact that it can be really hard to create an entire book on a movie from a time when they weren't so exhaustively documented. And of the records that do exist, tracking them down can be an almost impossible challenge, especially anything that's been lost or destroyed. What resources was and wasn't the author able to access? Although in this case the book is an official Paramount supported endeavor, so it seems like the author, Sarah Gristwood, has thankfully had access to most everything, which results in some of my favorite parts of the book that I'll mention later. But even so, there's also the severe handicap of not being able to create a whole lot of new insight, since most of the people involved in making the movie are no longer around to be interviewed. So there's a lot of reliance on existing material, newspapers, books, magazines, which I actually think is really good when it's taken from sources that most people probably wouldn't read otherwise. But then there's the flip side, where you have situations like, for example, most of the quotes from the director, Blake Edwards, are taken directly from his interviews that are on the DVDs and Blu-ray. The imagery throughout is fantastic and will probably be the thing most fans appreciate. There's behind the scenes photos, stuff from the promo shoots, a couple of deleted shots, but there's also a lot of images I have mixed feelings about, because it can be very hard to tell the difference between frames taken directly from the movie versus slightly different versions taken by the unit stills photographer. Some photos you definitely can tell from the unit photographer, and those are great. They present a slightly different look at a scene, but there are a bunch of photos where I can't tell the difference if they're directly from the film or not. Even though usually I absolutely hate stills from the movie and books, but for older movies I think it's fine, since there may not be a whole lot of other imagery to use instead. But for this book specifically, I am a little disappointed, since I know for a fact Paramount has other behind the scenes photos, promo photos, and deleted scenes photos for Breakfast at Tiffany's that aren't in the book. And so I think those should have been used instead of these stills that are or appear to be identical to what you see on screen, especially because, as you've no doubt noticed, this book does mostly use full page and full spread layouts for its images, and so you'd hope that it would be something more worthy to warrant taking up so much space. So as we finish up the flip through, I think it might be a good idea to just go through the contents in order to get a better picture of what the book covers. So it starts out with discussing Truman Capote and the original novel, with a focus on possible inspirations for Holly. Then it moves on to the acquisition of the film rights, and this was the part that I realized we were in the hands of a good author. I really appreciate that there is very little editorializing in this book. It's not a rose-tinted retrospective, but a frank one. It mentions missteps, conflicts, conflicting stories, including Paramount's ridiculous official press releases. It never feels like a puff piece for the studio or anything's being swept under the rug to present a picturesque view of the production, which is something you do get with a lot of making of books that are released concurrent with the movie. Then it moves on to the development of the script. There are also a couple of photos throughout of original script pages that differ from the final film, which leads me to my absolute favorite part of this book, the scans of various original documents. There's not many, and I really wish there had been more, but we've got an internal memo from the producers to the executives, a telegram, script pages like I said, the Moon River sheet music, and the best of the best, the letter from the MPA following their review of the script telling the producers what parts they'd have to cut in order to be approved. It's so ridiculous, but so fascinating. Next up is a chapter on Audrey Hepburn, which I liked the least. It's just sort of about her. But I also realize there are definitely going to be Hepburn fans who probably think this is the best section. And after that is a shorter but similar chapter for the rest of the cast and who they are. Next is the costuming, the highlight of which is artwork in the form of Edith Head's costume designs. And actually, this chapter is a good example of the approach the book takes. So it doesn't really talk about the behind-the-scenes whys and hows of the costuming for the movie, but rather the people involved and social, cultural, historical information that sort of relates to whatever's being discussed. Same thing for the next chapter, which is on the locations, where most of the information is about New York or the Paramount backlot, which I think really sums up the content of the text for this book as a whole. It feels like a third is directly about the making of the film, while 2/3 is stuff around the film. The next chapter is a lot of anecdotes on the shooting of specific scenes, then a chapter on Moon River, which is actually another interesting example for a different reason. There's no discussion of the music as a whole, it's just about the creation of Moon River, which I actually really enjoyed because even though it was specifically focused on only the one song, it was focused, deep, and comprehensive on a behind-the-scenes topic directly about the making of the film. The next chapter is also really good. It's about the movie's release and reception, including good and bad period reviews. Again, a really nice lack of bias or agenda, not trying to falsify a legacy for the movie. And then the last chapter is on the movie's post-release history. And again, I was really impressed with how Sarah Gristwood handled this final chapter. I was expecting some pontificating fan waxing lyrical about how this is the most important and beloved movie ever made, but instead it's an interesting and factual explanation of the continued impact the film has had. And then lastly, there's also a bibliography, something which is rarely seen but always appreciated. The only other book on Breakfast at Tiffany's that I'm aware of is called Fifth Avenue 5 a.m., which I think came out after this book. And if you're a big fan, then it's probably worth looking into, but all I'll say is it doesn't get my recommendation. Unlike this 50th anniversary companion, which may not exactly be what you want, but I can't imagine any true fan who won't treasure it as a beautiful tribute to the movie. In this video, we're going to be taking a look through The Art of the Incredibles, and this isn't really going to be the usual objective critique of the book itself. I'll still point out potential areas of dissatisfaction, but there's actually not a whole lot to say on that front. Instead, how much this book appeals to you will just come down to personal tastes and whether or not you like the art you're seeing. So while your eyeballs make that decision, hopefully your earballs will allow me a more subjective ramble about the art than I usually do, which I'm excited about because this is easily my favorite Pixar art book, despite the fact that I don't think it's an especially well done art book. But that doesn't matter compared to just how fond I am of the very classy art direction and how completely I adore the style used for most of the art, which is that sort of minimalist, mid-century modern cartoon style made up of strong shapes and silhouettes, and sort of runs the gamut from Sol Bass graphic design to more illustrative Mary Blair style. I don't actually know what the technical terms and distinctions are for this style, but I just use the terms mid-century modern or retro modern, but just so you know that in those cases, modern doesn't actually refer to present day. Typically it does have a real retro vibe, like in this case, because of the style's prevalence in the 50s and 60s, but you still see it, or at least an evolution of it, in art today. Editorial and vector illustrations bear a lot of similarities to mid-century commercial art. Many children's book illustrations still very much inspired by that Little Golden Book style, and especially in animation and backgrounds for everything from the Flintstones to the Powerpuff Girls was really defined by the minimalistic stylized art and animation that UPA were making at the time. And there always seems to be some evidence of it in visual development for feature animation. There'll be some artists and pieces that harken back to this retro modern style. But the reason I like this Incredibles book so much is that there's just a lot more of it, because it's very much the bedrock that the Incredibles visual aesthetic and world is built on, and it really informs the final look of the movie a lot more than it does in other films. I love how it's set in such a subtly stylized but undefined time period. I know in the movie it specifically denotes 1962, but I remember an interview with Brad Bird from a few years ago where he said that was just incidental rather than literal, and that for the whole development of the movie, their intention was to make it feel like what someone in the 60s would think the near future would look like. So there's super advanced technology, but the mid-century aesthetics and architecture is still predominant. And I really love this idea of it being out of time and things being more subtle and evocative rather than overstated and literal, as opposed to going all in and making it a cliche period piece like Far Out, we're in the 60s man, or Beep Boop, we're in the future human. And this idea of giving something a certain feeling or mood is also why I really like the art. A lot of concept art and art books focused on being almost a literal design blueprint for what should appear on screen, and of course that's an essential part of making an animation, art that is a design tool. But it's not necessarily the most interesting to look at compared to the visual development work that is more inspirational, that is meant to convey a sense of feeling more than anything. And I think with this book, that's a lot clearer. I can look at it and see how the feeling captured in the art translated successfully to screen, if not literally. And yeah, there are plenty more standard, less stylized pieces and traditional animation sketches that you'd expect from an animation art book, but this one does seem more defined by its retro-modern influence. For me, the real standout artists are Lou Romano, whose work defines everything I've said so far about why I love this style and is the biggest reason to get this book. There's a 4-page gatefold of his color script, which is just amazing, and there's also Teddy Newton, who contributes some really interesting pieces through collage, especially his character designs, which I don't recall ever seeing anything like it in animation concept art before. In fact, I don't even think I like it in and of itself. But going back to what I was saying about the art being more impressionistic than literal, it's perfect for this movie, for this modern style, strong, minimalist shapes, powerful silhouettes. And I think these exaggerated elements and bold silhouettes are so fitting for the superhero theme. It actually reminds me a lot of Batman the Animated Series, which is obviously a lot darker, but a lot of the visual cues seem very similar. Also, considering this is a superhero movie, there really isn't anything reminiscent of comic book art, with the exception of only one piece, which some people might find surprising or disappointing, so it's worth pointing that out. Although, despite technically being a superhero movie, it's pretty clear that both the art and story are much more influenced by the spy movies that became popular during that 1960s period. One thing you might notice in the book is that there's not much design evolution for the characters, which is usually a bad thing in art books, but in this book, at least they actually kind of account for it by mentioning that there wasn't much change in the characters from how they were initially conceived. It's also mentioned in the book that they had to reduce the amount of 2D artwork in order for things to be more efficient or something. Whether that's acceptable or very disappointing will be up to you. And now that we're onto the subject of the text, I would describe it as being okay. It's nothing special, I could take it or leave it, but I am happy it's there. It's mostly a standard commentary from the filmmakers giving little insights on a range of things, but this range is something I would have liked to be a little more limited. There's a lot of stuff about story and technical 3D animation stuff, and most of it is super interesting, but it feels more like it should be in an art and making of book. Whereas because this is an art book, I would have liked more of the commentary to focus on the art, specifically about inspirations and style and such, sort of the stuff I've been talking about in this video, except from people who actually know what they're talking about and not my uninformed drivel. In fact, in recording this, I felt pretty frustrated by my lack of artistic knowledge and terminology and not able to describe things as accurately as I should. But anyway, there definitely is a bunch of art-related commentary in here, but I feel like as a book on the art, the text could have focused more on that rather than the movie as a whole. But this isn't really an actual criticism, more just wishful thinking because I am so interested in it. In fact, really the only thing I don't like about this book is that even though the quality of the art is impeccable, the quantity, however, is very peccable. Like most Chronicle books, it's well designed and attractive, but once you start examining it, you notice that it's also very sparse, with maybe only 2 images per page on average, which makes it look like an exhibition catalogue. And this is something that most Pixar art books struggle with, even The Art of the Incredibles too, and it just feels so empty compared to many of the DreamWorks and Disney animation art books, which are much more impressively and creatively designed and have a lot more text and images. Which is weird since Disney owns Pixar and both have their art books made by Chronicle, and so it's a shame to see how easy it would have been to fit a whole lot more into this book, and an especial shame considering how much I like the art that is in here. Obviously we can't change that, but as it stands, this book still contains some of the most beautiful, stylish, and inspiring concept art I've seen. This is a review of Star Wars: The Illustrated Companion. I have no interest in wasting your time, so I'll say straight away this book is pointless garbage that I wouldn't recommend to anyone. So with that being said, you don't need to watch any more of this video. Instead, invest the time perusing my Star Wars playlist, which is full of books actually worthy of your consideration. However, if you're determined to find out exactly why this book is so terrible, then let's get this over with. Essentially, this is two completely different books in one. The first half is about the story, people, and places of Attack of the Clones, and then the second half is behind-the-scenes stuff about the movie, both of which are concepts that are explored in separate, much better books. So why they need to be half-assed and stitched together here, I'm sure I don't know. And that encapsulates my overall feeling towards this book, which is, why does it exist? You know, beyond someone at Lucasfilm or wherever wondering just how much money they can milk fans for. I find that a lot of bad books actually start out as good ideas that just go awry in the execution. This book, however, is bad from its very conception. So let's break it down. The first quarter is about the characters, and 99% of the information is just stuff you already know if you've seen the movie. Of the 1% of information that doesn't come directly from the movies, half of it seems to be taken from stuff cut from the script, which you'll already have if you've got the Attack of the Clones art book, which you 100% should. And then the other half of the percent is just minor references to things like Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan searching for the Sith holocron, or Django and Zam Wesell's previous work together, or what a moisture farm is. Depending on how many other Star Wars books, comics, etc. you've read, you may know all that extra stuff already. I haven't, however, so I'm not gonna lie, I did enjoy that stuff that adds extra detail beyond what's directly conveyed in the movies, but it is never anything more than an infinitesimal crumb buried under a mountain of shit. And this applies to the images as well, which utterly destroy any hope this book could possibly ever have. It's made up of 10 billion stills taken directly from the movie, with very occasional art pieces or portrait shots that have already been presented much better in other books. The second quarter of the book is about the planets, and this is actually the best part of the book, which is not saying much at all since it mostly draws from information taken directly from the movies, or just describing self-evident things, while 75% of the page is taken up by stills. I mean, you can see as we're going through, the majority of the space in this whole book is taken up by worthless images. But in this part, there's at least a little more extra information and lore and a nice map of the galaxy, but again, there are already other books that do this sort of thing a million times better, e.g. the Essential Atlas or the Illustrated Universe. And so even though I actually liked that the book introduced me to little tidbits I didn't know, it's just not worth it. Compare this book to the Attack of the Clones visual dictionary. Both very similar in what they're trying to achieve. The visual dictionary uses a lot of screenshots, reiterates a lot of information directly from the movies, and also has a lot of pointless, obvious information, and that's possibly because it's more aimed towards kids, but at least it has the decency to present itself infinitely better with a more clearly defined direction and using a lot more interesting images like close-up photos of props. And overall, the ratio of interesting to boring is much better because the text is just little snippets, so you don't have to wade through as much crap to find something interesting. So then we get to the last two quarters of the book where it suddenly decides to become a making-of book, which is weird when an awesome making-of book already exists for Attack of the Clones called Myth Making. And one thing I lament about every making-of book ever is the cruel reality that 200, 300 pages is never enough to adequately capture an entire production of a movie. So how good can a book be that tries to do it in 70 pages? And in fact, it's not even 70 pages, it's half that, since the last quarter of the book is just spotlights on different cast and crew. Basically just super short career biographies and soundbite type quotes. But imagine if they were using this behind the scenes section to supplement the main making of book and the art book with all new content, extra stuff they couldn't fit into those books. I have never seen something like that done before, but that would just be amazing, and I would forgive everything else that's bad about this book, but of course that's not the case. And the reason that thought came to me is because the only exception is the spread on costuming, which does have a handful of drawings that weren't featured in the art book. But because that's the only time the book does that, all it does is highlight how disappointing and ill-conceived the whole thing is. And I just can't understand how there never seems to be anyone, or at least anyone with a brain, better coordinating these sort of publishing efforts. So rather than complementing or working with the other books, this illustrated companion tries to cover the exact same ground as the myth-making book in even less pages, including some of the exact same facts and quotes. And so it's also short and shallow that it can only discuss things in the broadest possible sense, which is something I just despise, and not even close to being worth it despite the minuscule smattering of unique text and images. Which means that both the first half and the second half of this book suffer from the same problem. It's just 99% recycled content and shallow nothingness with 1% that's actually unique and good. And I know how it can be so frustrating when you're a fan to be tempted by a book just for that 1%, those tiny flecks of gold even when they are buried under mountains of bullshit, but I promise you, as a massive fan myself who is very susceptible to that temptation, this is not worth it. And so despite the very, very few images, artworks, information and quotes I haven't seen before, I'll still be getting rid of it after this, as it's not even worth the 1 centimeter of shelf space it takes up. But let's end on a productive note with some alternative recommendations. If you want to experience the story, characters, and visuals of the movie, watch the damn movie. If you want to start branching out into the expanded universe and learning about things outside of the movies, there are trillions of essential guides and encyclopedias and so forth, but I would recommend the Ultimate Visual Guide, which I've reviewed, and like with the Visual Dictionary, it's interesting to compare it to this book, because the Visual Guide is also just made up of information and images recycled from other sources, but it's drawing from hundreds of sources, comics, novels, games, unlike this illustrated companion, which takes 99% of its content from one source. This illustrated companion also stands out as being really weird because, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's a Phantom Menace or Revenge of the Sith equivalent, which just seems like it confirms that this is a bad, foolish idea that they had no intention of supporting like they did with all the other series of books they released for the trilogy, which they even did for the movie scrapbooks, which are actually worse than this book, unfathomable as that may seem. And then if you want to learn more about the making of Attack of the Clones from a book that's actually good, be sure to check out the review I did on myth making. This is a review of Myth and Magic, The Art of John Howe. The book was originally published in 2001, but the one I've got here is a more recent reprint that was done to capitalize on the release of the Hobbit movies. But the only difference as far as I can tell is that on the cover it says designer for the Hobbit films and a slightly different blurb that references him working on the 2 Hobbit movies. Speaking about the blurb, it's almost entirely Lord of the Rings focused, and I mean everything about this book, from the cover images to having Peter Jackson's name on the cover as the writer of the foreword. It's all pushing the Lord of the Rings angle very, very hard. And that's fine in the sense that most of John Howe's professional career has been centered around Tolkien's work, but I do want to make sure you understand that the book also has a lot of fantastic non-Middle-earth works too, which I actually think I enjoyed more just because I wasn't as familiar with them. There's also a lot of cool previously unpublished works too, which is always a great incentive to buy an art book. Now, it's not a complete collection of everything John Howe has done, but the book does claim that it collects all of his Tolkien Tolkien-related works. However, there are two caveats to that. One, that doesn't necessarily mean it contains all of his unpublished or private Tolkien works, and two, you have to remember that this book was published before the Fellowship of the Ring movie was released, and so doesn't contain any of the concept art he did for the films. But I actually prefer that that's the case. There's also quite a bit of text, although the font is super large. There's some commentary from John himself that gives context to a lot of what you're looking at, as well as his thoughts and ideas, which I liked all of that. I also really liked Peter Jackson's foreword and Alan Lee's afterword. What I liked a little less is that most of the text seems to be contributions from authors whose book covers were painted by John, heaping praise on him, and then also John himself praising other authors whose books he's worked on. And I mean, it's not actually as bad as it sounds. I didn't really mind it. It's just that outside of a foreword, which is the only place for it, I hate people wasting space in books with over-the-top flattery that is of no benefit to the reader. The book has over 200 images, which for a book of this size and art of this type is very good. Very less good is the design, layout, and size of some of the pieces. Overall, the design and layout is very clunky, but only seriously affects maybe 10% of the images, and there's no argument about like page count or the number of images. The space is there, it's simply bad design. Like, look at this. They've spread the bottom image across 2 pages so stuff gets lost in the center, yet look at how much blank space there is to the right. Why wouldn't they just put the whole image on 1 page there? Absolutely mental. Because John Howe's work is so sweeping and epic, the images that are too large aren't really a problem, albeit often unnecessary. Instead, it's the number of artworks that are printed ridiculously small, and it's just weird when the majority of the images are presented really well. Most seem to be around half page, which I think is perfect for what's being displayed, but then it's frustrating when it occasionally gives you 1 image spread across 2 whole pages, and then you turn the page and there's an equally epic and detailed piece that's reproduced at 1/10 of a page. There are a bunch of other little things that make the layout very awkward, but there's not much point getting into that because honestly, none of it is so bad that it should discourage you from getting the book. The few poorly sized images are honestly just a slight annoyance when compared to the fact that the rest of the book's fine and John's work is so amazing that it's more than worth it. However, the reason I really wanted to highlight these layout problems is because there is an alternative you may want to consider. So a few years after Myth and Magic came out, a French book was published called John Howe Art Book, and although for most intents and purposes they are very, very similar books, they are not exactly the same book. The French book has more pages, what appears to be more text, although only in French, but most importantly, the images are sized and laid out a bit better. Still not perfect, because they sometimes go the other extreme and make the images unnecessarily large, but overall a notable improvement. I don't think there was a single instance of a piece being too small in that book. However, because nothing can ever be convenient, there is a trade-off. And the trade-off is that while the vast majority of images overlap between the 2 books, both also contain artworks that the other doesn't. And so there's no clear winner as to which is the better book, it just depends on what's more important to you. Myth and Magic, if you're outside of Europe, is going to be a lot cheaper and easier to get a hold of since it had a larger print run, and seems to have maybe a slightly greater quantity of images. Meanwhile, the French John Howe art book has much better presentation of the works. And as for text, obviously, if you don't read French, you're going to miss out on that. However, I will say that although the text in Myth and Magic is nice, it's definitely not essential. And in terms of my personal opinion, I got Myth and Magic before I was aware of the French book, but if I had my time again, I would prefer the French one, since when I get an art book, I get it for the art, not the text. Even though good text in an art book is always a really nice bonus, it's not worth the disservice the book is doing to a lot of the artworks. But because there is so much overlap between the 2 books, I really don't think it's worth getting both unless you are the most uber John Howe fan who wants absolutely everything. But for everyone else, honestly, I wouldn't stress too much about which one to get. Either way, you're going to get a great collection of some really amazing fantasy art, and especially in terms of Middle-earth. However, if you are interested in the French book, to add further complications, in 2019 a French publisher crowdfunded a new edition of John Howe art book with the same cover but with 16 new pages. I haven't actually seen that one, so I don't know how it compares, but it is still available on their website. In terms of other John Howe books, he's done a bunch in addition to the various books he's illustrated and anthologies his work has appeared in. There are a couple of more how-to art theory type books, but I don't know much about those. There's also Lost Worlds, which I'll only mention here since I will do a full review on that. There's also another French art book called Sur la Terre de Tolkien, which I haven't had a chance to look through, but it seems like it might be more of an exhibition catalogue with lots of blank space and way too large images. And then lastly, there is A Middle-earth Traveller, which is a beautiful little book focused solely on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And thankfully, you don't need to worry about how this book compares to the other art books. It contains a little bit of the Middle-earth art already featured in his other art books, but the majority seems to be concept art he did for the films, which Myth and Magic has none of, so it's definitely different enough that you can get both books without feeling like you've paid for the same thing twice. It's got too much black and white sketch stuff for my taste, but if you like that sort of thing, definitely check that out, along with my Lord of the Rings / Hobbit playlist, which has tons of other movie-related books featuring John's work. This is a review of Mythmaking, Behind the Scenes of Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, which is kind of a dumb title considering the other two prequel books were more succinctly titled The Making of Star Wars Episode whatever. However, this is insignificant as this is an outstanding making-of book. One of the best I've read in I don't know how long, and it's all thanks to the text, which is a delightful surprise after the rather lackluster affair that was the making-of book for Phantom Menace. So I wasn't expecting much from this one, as it's written by Jodie Duncan, who co-authored the Phantom Menace book, whereas with this book she's the sole author, and I don't want to unfairly speculate why that is, but whatever the case, this one's a much better book text-wise. And I don't want to oversell it, it's not like this is comparable to the Rinsler making-of books for the original trilogy. This is still very much in the style of your standard movie tie-in making-of book, and so it still has some of those same foibles. But I've been reading a lot of these kind of books recently and just despairing over how boring and poorly written and thought out and samey they are. If you watched my review I did the other week on the Prince Caspian book, this book's basically the complete opposite of that. And so it was just completely refreshing for this book to come along and remind me, no, these books can be really good when they're written by someone who knows what they're doing. So what exactly is the writing in this book doing that's so great then? Well, largely it's due to the way the book's structured. It follows the movie chronologically, scene by scene, whereas with most making-of books, each chapter focuses on a certain department or area of the film. And I've come to find this is a pretty bad approach because it results in the author or the filmmakers discussing what their job is in a general sense and what they did on the film in a general sense with maybe a few specific examples. Whereas in this book, the author and the filmmakers, rather than having to summarize all the work they did on the whole movie, which is impossible, instead in this case they only have to supply an anecdote for each scene, which is much more manageable. And so it feels like a much better dissection of the movie. How or why was this specific thing done for this specific scene? And this specificity is what so many other making-of books lack. It's a very intelligent way of avoiding the broad view most making-of books force upon themselves. So with this book, it actually feels like I'm learning about the making of this movie. I don't know how many making-of books I've reviewed where I've said something to the effect of, yeah, there is some really good information in here, but you've got to dig through a lot of boring crap. Whereas with this book, with the exception of a little too much retelling of the story, I would say at least 85% of the text is great and informative and deserves to be here, which is actually an insanely high percentage compared to most other books, unfortunate as that may be. In addition to plenty of really nice anecdotes throughout, the book's very fact-heavy. Dates, places, how things were done, why things were done, a lot of emphasis on why certain things were added or cut, which I really like. And so it's a really great record of this production. Every so often there'll be a page called Notes from the Set, which capture these sort of candid, fly-on-the-wall, particular moments in time. It's a cool way to really make you feel like you're there on the set, even for just a brief moment. Now, the book is certainly not super in-depth or comprehensive, but that's more to do with the sad reality that a book only has a finite number of pages. But working within that framework, the information here is so much better than what you typically find in these sort of books. The images are also pretty great. Models, progress shots, animatics, a little bit of art, not a whole lot, but of course tons and tons of really great behind the scenes type photography. Overall, it's just a lot of stuff that I've never seen before, including Zam Wessel's hair, so what more do you want? Less impressive is the number of stills from the movie itself, which there are just so many, and it's completely unnecessary. I wonder if it's because they often release these books ahead of the movie and are just using it to promote ticket sales by showing off what a visual spectacle it is. Which, I mean, I don't even know what sort of idiot would read these sort of books before seeing the movie anyway, so I just wish they'd got rid of all the stills and used that space for more text. Now, so far I've tried to carefully qualify my praise by saying things like the writing in this book is amazing rather than this book is amazing. And that's because, taken as a whole product, the book is severely let down by the design. And I have to take the time to point this out because this is seriously one of the ugliest books I've reviewed on this channel. It's just an over-designed eyesore. Absolute bedlam. I love visually overwhelming books, but this is just a gaudy fever dream. I mean, even the cover, not only is it boring, they couldn't even just take normal images and make them monochrome. They also felt the need to posterize them, but it just makes it look bizarre and low quality. I also don't think I've ever criticized a book for having too many images before, but just going back to what I said about getting rid of the stills, even if they couldn't have added more text, just get rid of them. The book already has enough great behind-the-scenes images without adding to the visual chaos. But ultimately, this is just sort of an indulgent rant because the fact is, although I absolutely believe bad design can completely ruin a book, in this case it really doesn't matter and shouldn't have any impact on your decision whether to get the book or not when compared to just how strong the content of the text is. And that's what pulls this book away from the blandness of the Phantom Menace making of book and brings itself to the usual place held by Star Wars books at the head of the class.